Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion that we will be engaging in for a bit today. Unfortunately, Reverend James Woodall from the Georgia NAACP is not able to join us today, but we have two very distinguished panelists to help us talk about some of the community-centered strategies that need to be implemented in order to help us restore our community, particularly after the year that we've had, this past year of dealing with COVID and all of the surrounding challenges, which were sort of layered upon top of a whole lot of other issues already. So I like to think about this time as being a time of multiple pandemics that kind of converged. And then here we are having to figure out how we're going to navigate ourselves forward. And I think it's so important for us to spend a good bit of time thinking about who we want to be following these challenges that have been presented to us. I think there have been people among us who are interested in really kind of thinking about trying to get back to where we were. But I think a better way to think is what is the invitation? What is the invitation that's being offered to us to reimagine community and to really imagine community without being so chaotic? And so the two gentlemen that are going to help us in discussing these issues and this subject are Rabbi Peter Berg and Reverend Matthew Wesley Williams. And I would invite you, Rabbi Berg, to introduce yourself a little further. And then Reverend Williams, if both of you will just introduce yourselves, and then we'll come back to when you finish, Reverend Williams, if you'll go ahead and make your remarks, and then we'll go to Rabbi Berg, and then we'll engage in some other conversation around some questions.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. It is truly an honor to be here with you today. Really, really a tremendous honor. And as we get ready to celebrate Passover in the Jewish tradition this week, I can think of no better forum, no better opportunity to express the values of Jewish tradition than the work that you're all doing today in this seminar. I'm Rabbi Peter Berg. I am the senior rabbi of the Temple, which is Atlanta's largest and Georgia's largest and Atlanta's oldest synagogue. You might recognize it from the movie Driving Miss Daisy in 1989 with Morgan Freeman and Jessica Tandy. You might be familiar with it because Leo Frank, who was in 1914 lynched and hung by a mob, is from the Temple. And you might know it from its historic bombing in 1958 by white supremacists when our rabbi, Rabbi Rothschild, walked hand in hand with Dr. Martin Luther King and advocated for racial justice. And that continues, of course, to be some of the work that we do today. So I think I'm going to turn it over to the Reverend now and then come back for my opening remarks. But I'm so happy to be with all of you today.
Likewise, it is a joy, a pleasure, an honor to be in this conversation with you, Dr. Meeks, and with you, Rabbi Berg. My name is Matthew Wesley Williams. I am the president, no longer interim, but president at the Interdenominational Theological Center, where I am also an alumnus. So I've returned home in that regard. And ITC is a over 6 decades old, historically Black theological seminary that educates future leaders at a nexus of the Black church. The I in the ITC is interdenominational. And so we have a kind of a peculiar positioning in which we prepare leaders for Black congregations across 5 denominations and more, who will go out and lead these congregations and faith communities in ways that foster justice and peace through a liberating and transforming spirituality. ITC students have been, since our inception, engaged in the life of the spirit, the life of the mind, but also the life of the community and struggle as a part of the Atlanta student movement and beyond, even up till now with Black Lives Matter. And we're proud to say that our missing panelist today, Reverend Woodall is also an ITC student. So we speak with pride about that. I've been instructed to offer my opening remarks and to kind of kick it off in that regard. And what I want to just first do is to honor, but also to acknowledge the significance of the title under which we gather for this conversation. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And it is it's a timely and I would say a appropriate ode to the last book written by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1967. And in many ways, the questions he was raising then are questions that we're reckoning with now. Some think we're on the back end of these multiple pandemics, but I would say we're right in the heart of or the eye of the storm. And so if we're having a conversation around where do we go from here, and how we build a path forward for community out of this moment that we've been in, I would first want us to focus in on these two words, from here, because we would have to reckon with where is here, where are we? And in King's moment, he was reckoning with the other side of the story of the civil rights movement that's not told. It's what happened after the bus boycott. It's what happened after the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts, where he was reckoning with fractured coalitions, with what he called white backlash, and his own internal growing disillusionment around the promise of America, and his growing awareness of the depths of white supremacy, and questions about the capacity for America's redemption, which, as he understood it, was tied to a radical reordering of values, which would then eventuate into a radical reordering of society, from what he called a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. And so in this conversation, I think it's important to begin with a shared sense of where we are. And it requires an adequate reckoning with the history that produced this moment. Rabbi Berg, I want to say how much I appreciate you naming the sacred time of this moment. And in our tradition, we are approaching Resurrection Sunday, what many of us call Easter. But what's important to know is that the days leading up to this sacred moment of triumph over the forces of death and destruction is a process of pain and suffering that ultimately leads to a story of redemption and overcoming. And so we have to, what we often caution our folks around is, don't rush to Easter until you reckon with Good Friday, right? Don't rush to a resurrection until you've reckoned with the cross. And for us, I think what that means is we have to reckon with the suffering and the kind of revealing of the what this moment has helped us to see. And I often refer to this moment as apocalypse. Now, when we watch The Walking Dead or any other the sci-fi shows and movies that we see, we think of apocalypse as the end of the world, but it's actually the unveiling, the disclosure of the world, and that's what apocalypse really means. And what we've experienced over the past year and more is an unveiling of what many of us already recognized, right? The disparities around health equity, the inequities with regard to income and wealth, and the ongoing issues around state-sponsored violence, police brutality, and those kinds of things. These are all issues that those who Du Bois says were born with a veil have been able to see with that second sight for some time. And so while many of us want to get back to normal, I think what many of us also recognize is that normal was unacceptable. And so to move forward into community requires a kind of reckoning with what this moment has revealed so that we might co-create an alternative future.
Rabbi Berg.
Thank you, Reverend Williams. I just want to say amen, and maybe I can use this time to invite you to preach at the temple on Friday night. That was so inspiring to me personally, and so clarifying for me. And I want to, in some ways, pick up where you left off with talking about this idea of new normal. You know, we throw this word around all the time. It's the new normal, and on the one hand, you're really right. This idea of what we all said was normal was just unacceptable. And on the other hand, we have to reckon with the fact that there's no going back to the way things used to be on every level. I mean, this virus has changed everything about the world in which we live. What I'd like to suggest today is that even in the sadness and the hurt that this virus has brought us, we are in a new normal, and even in sadness and challenging times, God is giving us a gift. And I think it does relate to the holidays of Passover and Easter, that God gives us a gift of a new way to imagine our lives and a new way to imagine ourselves. I mean, think back to last year at this time. We were so certain of technological advances that we now know have completely and utterly failed us. We can now see that our immense power as a world superpower is unable to fend off a threat that we can't really see and we can't really even understand. And it has become clear to us that even great wealth does not assure our safety, and it does not assure our security. So the new virus, which is not so new anymore, gives us a new mission. And the virus brings to bear what people who have been oppressed and people who have been marginalized have known for a very long time. That the injustice, that the old order is absolutely unsustainable. And I want to go to sort of a keynote of the Jewish tradition. You know, we in the Jewish tradition, we read the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and Hosea with extra gusto and extra pride. We read every Shabbat from the prophetic reading. And I'd like to suggest that now is our time and now is our chance to be prophetic. To imagine a new and flourishing world, a world in which we're more compassionate, a world in which we're kinder to other people, and a world in which we share in ways that we have not done before. A world in which we actually become more magnanimous than we could have ever imagined. So imagine with me for just a few moments. Imagine what the environment might look like in the future. Remember when we were stuck at home for several months at the beginning of the pandemic, nobody was driving at all. And all of a sudden we saw that the skies were clear and the air was unpolluted. So imagine what it would look like if we actually took seriously the notion that our air and our water are in deep trouble. Imagine treating prisoners differently, even releasing prisoners that constitute no threat to society whatsoever. In this world in which we live, in America, the country that puts more people in prison than any other country in the world. Think about the worst countries that you could imagine. We put more people in prison than any of them. So imagine this time to rethink that a little bit differently. Imagine providing provisions for student debt. In fact, working to completely eliminate student debt. Imagine a new way to respond to homelessness that prevents tenants from being evicted and at the same time actually rewards landowners for the way in which they work to sustain their renters, right? This is what we're learning in pandemic times. And once everybody's vaccinated, we can't stop learning and doing what this virus has taught us. So what is the prophetic task? The future doesn't lie in old, treasured realities. It belongs to us, to bold, faithful thought that evokes bold action. This has always been the prophetic task. And now, in this year, in this pandemic year, it belongs to each and every one of us. I'd like to suggest that God is present and God will see us through this pandemic. But what really happens to the world depends on whether we have the courage and whether we have the imagination to devise new ways of actually being human together, or whether we go back to the old way, the way things used to be, the way that Reverend Williams said doesn't work at all. God is with us even in our distress, and God is with us even in our sadness. God is with us, giving us gifts and encouraging us to show the kindness and the love to others who are in their time of need. And our job now is to imagine.
Thank you so much. I did get a note that Reverend Woodall has been delayed because of voter. Uh, he's at the Capitol and they're voting on the voter suppression legislation, and he's gotten tied up with that. Just so the audience knows that he didn't just drop off the planet. He's out doing God's work, trying to ensure that the democracy that we thought we had stays intact when people are working so hard to destroy it. So just so that people know, one of the comments that you've made are so lead to so many other questions that we can, pathways we could go down. And one of the ones that I would like to pursue for just a minute, we talk about community, and Dr. King talked about, where do we go from here, chaos or community. Basically, I would want to ask you to reflect upon the question of, have we actually ever had community in this country? Where we talk about restoring community, but do we have any community to restore? Or are we trying to figure out how to build community? I would just like to hear you talk about that for a minute. Reverend Williams,
Rabbi?
you want to go next? Yeah, well, if you go next, Reverend Williams, since he just spoke, and then we'll trade off like that.
Will do. So you raise a question that is very much a stirring in my soul. That there's a lot of talking about restoration and return to community, but that assumes, of course, that there was some prior state, some nostalgic moment that we can return to and go back and recover. What I think my response to that about whether we have ever really had community in this country, I think what we would have to do is to go back, as we say, to use a con term, sankofa. We would have to go back and fetch the moments, the movements, and the examples where we have experienced community, and amplify those models. And even when those were experiments that ultimately did not sustain themselves, we would need to go back and fetch those examples, try them again, see what may work, and learn from the lessons of our forebears. I would say that there have been moments of authentic community. I think of even right here in the state of Georgia, in America's Koinonia Farms, where they weren't just talking about racial reconciliation, they were living it in a moment where for Black and white folks to be in community together, to live together, to work together was illegal, both de facto and de jure. That kind of an example still exists. Those don't get into the meta narrative often of folks who've done the hard work. But I think in our congregations, in our communities, but even some models like Koinonia and others, there are examples of where community actually has taken place in spite of the larger kinds of systems that have consistently snuffed out the life chances of our people. precisely because it was those systems have been built on a particular kind of imagination, Rabbi. I'm so grateful for your lifting up this question of imagination because, I believe imagination begins with a notion of the self, what it means to be human, and the economic, social, political systems that we operate in have been dominated by this notion of the rugged individual, the atomic unit, um, and not by the spirit of what in South Africa they call Ubuntu, the idea that a person can only be a person through other people. And as Dr. King said, I cannot be what I ought to be unless you are what you ought to be. That our destinies are inextricably tied to one another. So have we had community? I think the question has to do with who's the we. and some of us have experienced it. And I think it's on us to amplify and build strength on strength where we have experienced and witnessed those things.
Yes, Rabbi.
Great question, Dr. Meeks, I'm gonna say yes, definitively we have had community, and boy have we not had community. But let me cite just a few examples. When the temple I mentioned was bombed in 1958 by white supremacists. We're located in Midtown on Peachtree. There are 15 other churches, and every single church opened its door so that we could have a space to worship, so that we could teach our children. And we even at the time rededicated our social hall, Friendship Hall, because of the sense of community that was built in that moment. So we have seen community, and we have seen what it means to build community. When Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and Atlanta, Dr. King's home city, of course, had to decide how are we going to honor our own beloved Dr. King. And if you can believe it, most of the city didn't want to do anything, including the business community. They wanted to do absolutely nothing. And it took members of the faith community, including our Rabbi Rothschild, who worked together with other ministers and with a very large company in Atlanta that you all know, Coca-Cola, to help convince the rest of the community that, my goodness, Dr. King is our own and deserves to be honored for receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And that led to the very first integrated dinner at a hotel where Black and white sat together and created community, right? So we have seen community. We have seen what it looks like. And we have seen it in the midst of this pandemic this past year, because we have learned more than just how to wash our hands a little bit better, although I think we certainly have learned how to do that. But we have acquired this year, I'd like to suggest, a new sense of neighborliness, right? Think about supermarkets and banks that have opened up special hours so that those who are immune compromised and elderly have access. Think about how many of us have taught those who don't know how to use technology well to order their groceries online so that they're able to receive it, particularly during the shutdown time. In our own congregation, some of our young teenagers wrote handwritten note to members of the congregation who were stuck at home, and teenagers met in a socially distant manner with individuals who lived alone and had no companionship. Those of you in Atlanta will remember, because this happened in other cities too, at 8 o'clock in the evening in Midtown, everybody coming out of their high rises and stepping out onto their balconies to applaud medical workers and those who were keeping us safe. Or in Eastlake, people who left jigsaw puzzles out on their front porches so people could exchange them and trade them and have something to do. Hotels that provided space for medical providers traveling the country to provide care. internationally. Think about in Israel, the pandemic actually helped create bridges between Jews and Muslims, between Israelis and Palestinians. Israeli hospitals seen around the world as a model for the highest level of care for everyone, regardless of religion, race, gender, background. And as this pandemic has exploded, I really think this sense of neighborliness has heightened. And what I'd like to, if God is really speaking to us in this time, by building up deeds of mercy and building up deeds of compassion, God is also calling on us to turn these merciful deeds into structures of generosity. And
Yes.
I guess I want to answer the question by asking a question, which is, what we've learned is that the well-being of our neighbors is the precondition for having a healthy neighborhood. And I just want to say that one more time, because I think it's the most important thing. The well-being of our neighbors is the precondition for having a healthy neighborhood. And I think that's the question that I want to rhetorically ask to all of our listeners today, to really think about and to really grapple with. How can we really make sure that the people in our communities are well, so that their neighborhoods can be well?
And both you and Reverend Williams have said wonderful things about this, but I want to be just a little bit pushy and say that even all of those examples, I mean, they're wonderful and true. There's still these like marginalized people that fall outside of those nets, and they don't have access to these kinds of acts of mercy. I'm thinking of people who live without shelter, or people in rural communities that are now having difficulties getting vaccinations because they don't have access to technology, and they don't have resources. And we've heard so much about how the health disparities have come to sit on the table as we have dealt with this pandemic, particularly in Black and Brown communities and in our Native Indigenous peoples communities. I mean, we talk about a lot of things in terms of marginalization and disparities and inequities, but we don't think about First Nations people as much as we need to, because they are so left out, and then African Americans and Latinx people. So even though we have done these things that both of you have mentioned, we've got so much work to do about inclusivity, because we still have too many people that fall outside of those nets and get left and don't get really thought about. And I think that's a part of the equation that keeps us all up at night, if we're really seriously thinking about how do we really build a cohesive construct within a particular geographic area that we could then call community. We have these wonderful incidents of people coming together and being good and caring about each other, but in the long run, there's so many folks that are still falling outside of those nice things. And that, to me, is something for all of us who care to stay preoccupied about. I want to go back to something
Dr.
that
Meeks,
yeah,
sorry, if I could just lift up one example, because what you said is so important. It'll take just 1 second. And
go right ahead.
That's the issue of maternal mortality. This issue is getting very, very little attention. In Georgia, we are in a terrible position here, and what's happening is that we have a high percentage of women who are dying after childbirth, either soon after childbirth or within the first month of childbirth. And some of it's, as you said, because they live far away and there's just no medical care in rural parts of our country. But some of it's people who are dying within a half a mile of a major trauma center. And often it is poor people, and often it is people of color, and it's because they're not being listened to by they're calling their doctors, and their doctors are being dismissive of them. And I think that this is an area that we really have to begin to focus on and pay attention to. People are falling through the cracks, and it's just unacceptable. And I know that Reverend Williams and I could come up with 100 examples, but I just want to agree, Dr. Meeks, with everything that you said. We have a lot of work to do.
Yes, I just always want us to stay very careful, because we do need to always be looking at the times when we can claim having done something, that we've done something right. But are you all able to hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. But we need to always be careful about the people that are falling outside of those things, and I just want to make sure we don't leave them out of this conversation. The focus here is to talk about wealth, of course, and wealth is about having many things in place so that you can live your life with a sense of being empowered and being safe and feeling free and liberated. We have a whole lot of people that we've just got to get up to the level of even being able to be just a step beyond survival. So as you think about the economics and the systems that we have put in place in this country, how are we going to do this? How are we going to navigate the people, the poor people, people that are barely making it, and people that have so much more than they could ever spend if they live 5 lifetimes? How are we going to build some bridges that can make things more equitable and create spaces where everybody can have what they need? I mean, I'm not so interested in that we should buy everybody a Rolls Royce, but I'm very interested in that everybody should have what they need in order to live life and become fully who God put them on the earth to be. That seems to me a very simple thing to want for people. So how are our religious communities, and since you all are both theologians, let's just stick to that. What's our responsibility as people of faith, and what are the mandates for us as people of faith to make sure that there's some equitable distribution of resources so that people can have what they need? So
I
both
would
of you
say,
can speak about that.
sure. Your question takes me to a couple of specific examples, but they're framed in the whole issue of land and food, as, of course, primary resources to sustain life. And your question takes me to two specific examples that have both to do with advocacy for policy, but also for advocacy for good policy, but then also the co-creation of on the ground alternatives that build power in communities, right? And in many cases, in many cases, we're advocating for one or the other, but it really it requires a both and more approach to addressing these longstanding issues. And so, on the policy side, there is since the early 1900s, there's a trend that every year since the early 1900s, Black farmers have lost, or Black families have lost 30,000 acres of land ownership per year since the early 1900s, and that trend persists. And that land loss has taken place by way of theft, by way of violence, by way of finagling with legal issues around heirs property and other kinds of things. But just recently, our Senator Reverend Warnock was able to work into the relief bill a provision that provided a significant amount of debt forgiveness for farmers who had been locked into debt with the USDA, which really righted a longstanding wrong that had been in which the USDA engaged in that same kind of predatory land loss that farmers have been suffering from the last 20 plus years. And that was really exposed in the Pickford case. And so that kind of policy is necessary to address these longstanding wrongs and to make sure that wealth is not just distributed, but retained, right? So it's not that folks are born without, but when you are in possession of resources that are plundered consistently at the level of the state, then we're dealing with a whole different kind of thing that's not just about the kind of local solutions that you can derive. So advocacy for policy that brings justice home is necessary. But then in terms of, I'm also thinking in terms of the kind of proximal solutions that asset-based solutions that derive from kind of the on-the-ground ingenuity of communities. I'm thinking about one of ITC's partners. We've just begun the development of what's called the Black Church Food and Land Security Institute, which partners with an organization called the Black Church Food Security Network in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, that network was born of, again, the local ingenuity of a small church Baptist pastor who looked at an acre of land in a food desert right alongside their church and said, okay, we're going to use this and we're going to grow on this land to distribute healthy produce in this area where we are not just in a food desert, we're in a food mirage because there's a Whole Foods up the street, but our people can't afford the healthy produce that's in the Whole Foods, right? So we can see it, but we can't touch it. And so they started to grow produce on their own land. What that evolved into was building relationships with farmers in the Mid-Atlantic region, Black farmers in the Mid-Atlantic region, and developing a distribution network of congregations who, paired with those Black farmers, began to deliver healthy produce to poor folk in the inner city Baltimore. Now, where did that come in handy? Well, when the Freddie Gray uprising took place, the major grocery store chains shut down the trucks that were supplying those chains, and the grocery stores were empty. But because those relationships have been built with local congregations and those networks of farmers, they were able to open up those streets, bring in trucks from those farmers in that region, and set up an alternative food system for about a 2 to 3 week period that delivered healthy produce to their people. That was the beginning of the Black Church Food Security Network that is literally building alternative food systems, not just in Baltimore, but elsewhere. And we're developing this institute at ITC to institutionalize those principles and practices. But it requires that kind of ingenuity where we use the assets that we have to build power and to build solutions. Like Fannie Lou Hamer said, when you can feed yourself and your family, nobody can push you around, right? That becomes a basis for economic and political power. But we also need to be able to use that power to put pressure on policymakers who distribute our tax dollars. And we need to make sure that those dollars are distributed in equitable and fair ways that recover some of the losses that have taken place as a result of predatory practices, even at the state level.
Those are so exciting to hear about. I can't wait to learn more about both of those things. And Rabbi Berg, would you have something to add?
I won't repeat what the Reverend said. It's so important, and my good friend Reverend Warnock, Senator Warnock, can just drop the mic, as they say, because what he did this week for African American farmers is I hope everyone has a chance to see this story, to read this story. It's life changing. I want to lift up two other areas for us to think about. One has to do with people who have criminal records that are not being processed. There are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people walking around this country who have criminal records that are not being processed. These are minor offenses. Someone, let's say, might 10 years ago they may have make something up, shoplifted, and nobody's prosecuting it. It's not going anywhere. But this person has a record. It means they can't get a job. It means they can't get a home. It means they can't have access to education or travel. The list goes on and on and on and on. So the questions that we started asking at our congregation, in partnership with Reverend Warnock's church, Ebenezer Baptist, Dr. King's Historic Church, is what can we do to eliminate this problem? And we began first by literally having judges come in and eliminate these criminal records so that people can be free. There is no reason that someone should be carrying around this record, should not have access to a job. It's not going anywhere. It's not being prosecuted. Nothing's happening with it. So we've had multiple days where people come to the congregation at 10 o'clock in the morning, and at 10:30, they walk away free and clear, able to get a job, able to get a house, able to contribute productively. And it has been life-changing. And we're working on changing the law so this happens automatically. It doesn't have to go through a formal record restriction summit. But I think that's very important. Another example that I want to lift is bail reform. It is the most economically unjust system that we have right now, where people of means are able to produce bail and people without means are not able to produce bail. And the system absolutely has to change. And there is a movement-wide effort to begin to make this happen. And I want, so those are just two examples, but I want to take a moment to just frame this all theologically, if we can, for a moment, these issues that we're both talking about. We see this in the Bible. When God gives the gift of freedom to the children of Israel. This is the Passover story that we celebrate this week. God not only builds up liberation, but also tears down the oppression of Pharaoh. Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann observes that Pharaoh presides over what he calls a system of extraction. And I think this is really important for all of us to understand. A system of extraction is a system where people of means take advantage of people without means. And God, in the book of Exodus, wants to dismantle the system of extraction. I might go as far as saying the entire book of the entire Hebrew scriptures, the entire Bible is all about God wanting to dismantle this system of extraction where people who have means take advantage of people who do not. And we still live under various forms of this extraction system. And God wants to break it down, and God wants us to be God's partners in breaking down this system of extraction. Racism in America is an extraction system. And what we have seen this past summer with George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others is that this whole system of white sanctioned violence is being challenged. And God willing, it's going to be broken down, but it's going to take a lot of work from a lot of us. Brueggemann makes another point that I think is really suggestive, which is that the consumerist economy is also an extraction system because it wants us to be busy all the time, because busy people don't have time to stop and busy people don't have time to reflect. And so I want us to really, from a theological perspective, understand that both Jewish and Christian tradition acknowledges that God wants us to dismantle this system that is positioned in the Bible, that God wants to partner with us in doing it, but we can't fall into the trap of this busyness means we can't roll up our sleeves and do the work that has to be done. And I really want to lift up this notion of racism being a system of extraction. And we have a lot of work to do in our country still.
I so appreciate you framing that the theological piece that way, because in so many circles what one hears is, oh, we'll have the poor with us always, and it becomes an excuse for not
Right.
being willing to think more deeply and clearly about how can we eliminate poverty. We do not have to sit and say that there's just got to be poor people. I mean, that's an absurd analysis,
Sure.
and it's not grounded in any of our religious text. I mean, people just interpret that the way they want to because it fits them. I was just thinking before you were talking about Exodus about how the mandate was to leave parts of the fields in the Jewish community for people who didn't have, so that they could come when you get through harvesting. You left something there for folks who didn't have access to things. And so, given that notion, and to think about what Dr. King said about the moral arc of the universe being long but bending toward justice, and sometimes I find myself really wanting to argue with him about that. Actually, he didn't say it first, but I want to argue about that, whether it really is bending toward justice. But let's say that this is really true, that it is a long arc, but it is bent toward justice. And given the kind of biblical mandates for those of us that are Jews or Christians, and I'm guessing other religious traditions have similar kinds of mandates, how do we put these things together in a capitalist society that is so cutthroat and self centered and basically just determined to keep itself going without caring really what happens to folks who can't just stand up and really fight for themselves? What is our responsibility? How do we, inside of our pews, inside of our buildings, our worshiping communities, how do we get the person in the pew who's worried about their 401s and all these things to make the connection between their responsibility as faithful people to contribute to the arc of the universe being moved toward justice? How do we do that? Because there's so much resistance in many places to wanting to even be compassionate toward people who don't have, let alone work on systems, changing systems to fix the problem, because it didn't just happen. It's a design. I mean, it's the way we set up stuff. And you're right, Rabbi Berg. Racism is underneath it all. I mean, that's the foundation it's sitting on. But what do we do? How do we do that? How do we get you all are leaders in faith communities, and how do we get these communities of the regular person sitting in the pew to get on board with this notion that, yeah, you've got 5 coats and somebody's walking around in sub-zero weather without a coat, it ought to worry you. And so how do we get that to be part of the consciousness?
Hmm. Well, there was a lot in your question, and I'll take a bit of it to say that part of what must be done has been done. And here's what I mean. What we've experienced over the past year has been a traumatic disruption of business as usual. One of the things that Dr. King, and so I say what needs to be done, part of it, we've seen glimpses of what must be done by what has been done within this last year, not just by the virus, but the ways in which everyday people have taken to the streets, have shut down highways, have attempted to put muck in the gears of the system as it is, to get folks to pull back and pay attention to the ways in which those gears are grinding people in the process. And so, given the fact that we are in an environment that works us to death, and attempts to uh, sugar us into entertainment and keep us kind of distracted with entertainment, and we go from labor to entertainment to labor with very little reflection. There's nothing more important than the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is not just, if I may interpret this, Rabbi, the Sabbath, in my judgment, is not just a matter of rest and ritual, but it is it's a pulling out of oneself from this extraction system, to be able to recalibrate one's identity and vocation in community. What are we supposed to be up to? So there has to be continued organized disruptions in the systems that exist. Because, as Dr. King said in Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, the dominant desire in this country has been for civility, but not for justice. It's been for an appearance of niceties, politeness, courtesy, but that's really why nothing moved until we saw George Floyd's neck with a knee on it. We've been shouting from the rooftops about police brutality for as long as I've been alive. But when the graphic depiction of a life being taken disrupted people's mythical narrative of the way things are, then all of a sudden, there's some action, there's legislation, there's redistribution of some resources. Really, that has to do with trying to bring back the appearance, in my opinion, of, well, this is who I want to say I am, but not addressing the root causes of what brought that knee to that neck in the first place, right? And so when communities are understandably talking about abolish policing, and let's recreate and think about a new way of ensuring the safety of our communities, it went beyond the capacity of folk to imagine what does life look like in our communities without police as we know it, right? And so we rejected that out of hand. So I think it requires disruptions that enable us to pull out of and pull back from these extractive systems to rethink about who we are. And I think our faith communities have the capacity to create those kinds of disruptions, but also to create those kinds of spaces in which people can reflect and rethink about who they are and how they're called to be in the world.
Yes, Rabbi Burke. Thank you, Reverend Williams.
Reverend, every time you speak, I've got you scheduled for another sermon at the temple. Thank you. But you're so right. I mean, if we wait every time for a need to be on a neck before we start to get worried and concerned, or a school to be blown up by guns and to be concerned, I mean, we know what the problems are. Why are we sitting here waiting for something to be a visual on a television screen? And I want to answer the question by sharing with you a teaching from Jewish tradition, which is that a worship service is supposed to take place in a synagogue or a building or a room that has windows. And it's nice to have lovely stained glass windows. It doesn't have to be. But the reason we have to have windows is it reminds us that the prayers that we recite in that space, you have to sort of see the world beyond it. And they're meaningless if they don't teach us to get up and leave that space and translate them to the world beyond. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dr. King's friend, said that he was praying with his feet. So it's not just about the words we say in our sanctuaries; it's about the actions that we take with our hands and with our feet. And we have an obligation at this time to speak loud and clear about the values of our traditions. And Dr. Meeks, you talked about the Jubilee year and the sabbatical year. That we have a Jubilee year coming up, right? This is a year in which we are supposed to make sure all our debts are forgiven. And there's actually a way to do this, right? If think about the horrific medical debt that exists in our world today. There's education debt, there's medical, there's all kinds of debt. But we can forgive debt. Something like $15,000 will take care of over $1.5 million of debt. What would happen if our faith communities decided to work together to eliminate the medical debt that is crushing the communities in which we live? This is very doable, and it's very inexpensive considering how much money buys how much debt. So that's just one example, or the example that you gave of leaving the corners of the field open so that members of the community who don't have can take. Now, what's interesting about the idea of leaving the corners of your field open is that it's done in a way that provides, the Hebrew word is kavod, dignity, right? It's that someone can come and take without knowing who is the giver, who is the receiver. It is done in a dignified fashion. And part of what the challenge of the way that our system is set up right now is that in order to give to someone, in order to help someone, we have to get a plaque and we have to get our name in bright red. The Bible establishes a system by which nobody gets credit for it. People do it because it's the right thing to do. And the Hebrew word for it, again, I promise I'm not going to use any more Hebrew, is tzedakah, which comes from the Hebrew word tzedek. You remember from Deuteronomy, justice shall you pursue. Tzedek, tzirdof. The word justice is repeated twice. There's no word in the Bible not there for a reason. We are commanded to pursue justice with great emphasis. And the word justice in Hebrew is a command to do something, not because it makes you feel good. You can feel good if you want, but you do it because it's an obligation and because you have to do it in order to maintain a civil society, in order to maintain a community. And I'd like to suggest that that we think about doing these acts of justice in a way that protect the dignity of the people in our communities and our neighbors. It doesn't the credit. We don't need credit. We need to provide dignity to all of those around us. So I want to make sure I leave us with that as well.
I just think those are so wonderful. I've been informed we've got about 8 minutes, and I'm going to ask you a question you're going to really have to be succinct. And I love everything that you all are saying, but earlier in our conversation, Rabbi Berg, you brought up the idea of courage, and I've thought a lot about courage and will, and I think that the reason why so many things don't get fixed in our country is because we don't have courage nor the will. And so I just would like to hear both of you talk for just a minute or two about how do we begin to get the person in the pew to start thinking that God's will is for all of God's people to have what they need. And we've set up systems that has caused that not to be the case. What do we do about it? And how do we open ourselves to the possibility of having the will and the courage to really want to solve the problems? We don't need to have people sleeping outdoors. We don't need to have mothers dying when they've had babies, because we've got the resources. So in a minute or two, can you say something about how do we get folks to be courageous?
Yeah. Well, when you lifted up the word that I appreciate Rabbi Berg mentioned, which is courage. I was reminded that the core, the root word, the Latin word core, speaks to heart. It speaks to one's center, right? And uh, what I've heard us talk about repeatedly is the people in the pew, everyday people, and I may be misguided, but my sense has always been that the people in the pew are not the problem. That in most cases, we who are in the pulpit are standing in the way of the people in the pew. And because we have been kind of situated in these roles where we think we're the custodians of the people's action, we've often stood in the way of what the people have wanted to do. But the best things that I think we can offer is a space in which we're not doing as much public speaking as we're doing public listening. That then invites the people to listen to their own hearts and to consider the kinds of self-awakening questions that invite them to rethink the world around them, and to understand that the world that we are experiencing is the result of a set of choices and agreements that we've made. That poverty is not a law, is not the law of gravity. It's a set of choices that we've made. And so I think one of the things that we have the capacity to do uniquely is to set aside space for people to reckon with their heart and align who they are with what they do, both on an
Yes, thank
individual
you.
level and on a collective level.
Thank you. And Rabbi Berg, in a couple of minutes, and then I'll have a couple
Great.
of minutes to finish.
You said 1 minute. If I can pull this off, it'll be the first time in 3,000 years of Jewish history that a rabbi has said something in 1 minute. And here it goes. We live in a world of compassion fatigue, right? We look at the world around us and we say there is so much hunger and sickness and poverty, and we wonder how we can possibly wrap our hands around it. Because it's too much, and sometimes we just want to throw our hands up in the air and give up and say, "I can't do it. If I can't, if I can't solve it all, how could I do anything?" And so I'm going to throw the covers over my head and stay in bed all day. And I think the answer to the compassion fatigue all around us is that God does not expect us to do extraordinary things. God expects us to do ordinary things, but to do them extraordinarily well. And that's our charge. We don't have to be Dr. Martin Luther King, and we don't have to be Mother Teresa. We have to focus on a few areas in which we can roll up our sleeves and can make a difference. And I think that's our charge and that's our mission. We just can't do it all, but we can't stay in bed either. So we have to, what's going to be the issue we're going to do? And I want to encourage you to reach out to your minister and your imam and your rabbi and say, sign me up. I want to work on this issue. And that's where I think we'll begin to see a change.
Well, thank you both so very much. This has been a delightful experience for me to get to meet you all. And I certainly want to follow up some more with conversation about these issues. I want to commend the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative for bringing theologians as well as others to talk about this issue, because wealth is about more than money. And it's very important for people to understand that. And in order to help people become wealthy, we need to be focusing up on their economic resources. But if you have money and no spiritual resources, you're still fairly bankrupt. And so I just think that it's so very important to keep highlighting those intersections. And I thank you both so much for your conversation today. And I hope that people will listen and pay attention. And the most important thing that I think we've said here today is that God's got a great imagination, and God invites us into that imaginative process. So we don't have to keep worrying about who we were, we can stay far more open to who are we to be and who are we to become. And all we have to do is look at creation and see how God loves diversity and newness and just it's so creative. I mean, I don't know how you can be alive and not pay attention to that. So I hope that people will be encouraged, and I thank the Wealth Building Initiative for inviting me to participate in this event today and for your presence. And it makes me feel good to know that I have two brothers like you working in this city to help make the place more of what God means for
Mhm.
us to have. I mean, God made a world that is supposed to work, and we messed it up. And it's our job to stay open to trying to fix it. So we will keep on doing our best, and we will keep holding each other in our hearts. Dr. Thurman says that the only place you can find true refuge is in another person's heart. And we need to
Yeah.
make sure that our hearts are open doors. So let us go forward and keep our hearts open and see who God sends to live there. Thank you so much.